So, hi Joshua. Welcome.
Thank you very much.
Welcome to Mindful Global Sales and Global Growth podcast. I'm super excited to have you here today.
Eh,
First of all, it's amazing to see you again after we met some time ago in spring in
mhm.
our beautiful country in Lithuania at the conference Nordic Negotiation Hub. This is where I got a chance to meet you and your colleagues in coming from real negotiation world. So I'm super, super proud and happy. And yeah, Joshua, let me know what is something that you would like to say to our global people all around the world doing business globally,
Mm.
how you would like to introduce yourself, because I know there are so many titles, there are so many amazing things we can learn about you, we can read about you, we can get from your books. But what is something that you would, let's say, how would you categorize and describe yourself to global business world?
Sure. Well, I've been involved in the world of leadership, negotiation, and dealing with conflict for about 30 years. And generally do a number of different things. Of course, get involved in practical negotiation challenges, et cetera, of my own, and then helping and representing other groups. Um,
Mhm.
But I also run a project at the program on negotiation called the Global Negotiation Initiative, which is based there. And we focus on international negotiations and working on those different kinds of challenges. And then I run a master's degree program at another university in organizational leadership and negotiation. So teaching people
Mhm.
how to become effective negotiators. And then I have my own consulting company. So I do a lot of work with you name it, governments, for-profit companies, nonprofits,
Yeah.
who knows, helping them to learn how to be more strategic in their negotiations and to really
Mhm.
begin to learn how to do this well. You know, it's I'm a big believer that this is a lifelong endeavor, and we can always get better, and we never stop learning how to be effective negotiators. So that's the overview,
Absolutely.
and it's a great life. I love doing it, and I can't imagine doing anything else.
Oh, that's amazing. And how did all start actually? When did you realize that you are amazing negotiator? And this is topic that you would like to share with the others.
Well, you know, it's interesting because in my undergraduate university degree, I didn't really study negotiation, although I was interested in conflict,
Mm.
and had spent some time looking at the Vietnam War era and the Holocaust and things like that. So there was definitely something there. Um, but believe it or not, one of the things that really pushed me down this road was that I actually, after university, I spent a year working, and then a friend of mine reached out and asked how things were going. And I said, it's okay, but I'm probably going to come back and think about doing something different from where I was. And I said, what are you doing? And he
Mhm.
said, well, I'm actually going backpacking for a year. I bought a round the world ticket and I'm going to go.
Ah,
And I said,
yeah.
really interesting. And he said, why do you want to go? And
Mm-hmm.
really, without thinking about it, I said yes. So I sold everything I owned and I went backpacking for a year, which perhaps from Latvia, that's not that strange, but for an American, it's very unusual.
Mm-hmm.
It changed everything I thought I knew about the world. And as I was traveling, I began to see more and more conflict happening all around me. I was in the middle
Yeah.
of a Hindu-Muslim riot. I was in um, the former Yugoslavia was coming apart. I was in different places,
Mm-hmm.
lots of different situations where conflict was the theme. So when I came back
Yeah.
traveling, I said,
Mm-hmm.
you know, I know I'm just one person, but I feel like I need to do something about this. So I applied to
Yeah.
graduate school, and that set me down this road. And you know, I was focused on conflict resolution, but I started working at Harvard full time for 3 years, and then I left to do my PhD, and then came back and worked another 10 years full time. And as I
Mm-hmm.
did that work, like I really started gravitating to negotiation because I noticed that people had a different view of negotiation than they did about conflict resolution. They
Yeah,
were open.
exactly.
There was, there wasn't what we would call baggage. When people would often say, "Oh, I don't have a conflict," because there's a stigma associated with
Yeah.
conflict, and there isn't with negotiation. And so I started to dig in more and more into negotiation and just found it fascinating, and then found myself involved in lots of different kinds of negotiations around the world. And as I said, with
Mm-hmm.
different kinds of groups, and it's only gotten more and more interesting for me as I've done this. So
Yeah. Yeah, yeah. So the first is we usually learn from, we don't learn from success, as you always say. We learn from failures, from problems, and conflicts is amazing lesson, I would say, right? To us when we happen to be part of conflict, or maybe observe the conflict, then possibly this is the chance to learn where we failed or where interests were not met, right? So
right.
what do you think, why in most of the cases, why conflicts are happening? Like, what is the key trigger?
Well, first of all, the one thing I would say is that conflicts are there's actually nothing wrong with conflict. I know that might sound strange
Good.
to your listeners, but conflict happens. It happens because
Mhm.
you're from Latvia and I'm from the United States, and our experiences have been really, really different, and our needs and wants are very different. So
Yeah.
I try to encourage people to think about conflict as part of the decision-making process, right? If you and I are talking about how to do something, we might have different ways to
Hmm.
do it. And so we might technically be conflicting. How we handle it is what matters, right? There are skills and
Yeah.
there's knowledge about how to handle conflicts effectively, which is what I've been teaching people for 30 years, right? And so
Hmm.
conflict in some way, interestingly enough, serves a purpose. It highlights that
Yeah.
something might not be working and that we should try to problem solve and figure out how do we deal with this, right? So I think the
Yeah.
first thing I would say to people who are listening is don't be so afraid of conflict. It's going to happen. It's going to be part of the process. And, there's a great quote by a guy named Hamilton Mabie, who was a commentator here in the United States. And he said, remember, a kite rises against, not with the wind. And
Yeah.
and I think that when you get pushback from somebody, that's healthy, because often we come up with better solutions when somebody says, "Well,
Exactly.
why is that the best solution? Why is that the best way
Mhm.
forward?" Right? So I think the first thing is, that conflict happens because it's a natural part of the decision-making process. The second thing is, do you know how to handle it? And if you don't, then you need to, seek out ways of learning to do this better and differently. And I really believe that. And yes, of course, there are destructive conflicts all around the world today. But in essence, destructive conflicts are a failure of people to handle them productively, in
Yeah.
whatever way we want to think about that. So,
Exactly.
and I also think there's, people are a product of their experiences. I think one of the big challenges is that when people have experienced a really difficult conflict, they don't want to go back to that. They don't want to do it again because it was painful.
Yeah.
And yet,
Hmm.
to your point, because negotiation and dealing with conflict is very difficult work, you're going to fail. It happens. It's the way it works. If you talk to anybody in this field, they will be able to tell you about some of their most significant failures, and hopefully they'll also be able to tell you what they learned from them, because the best negotiators,
Yeah.
the people who deal with conflict on a daily basis, are failing, and
Hmm.
they're learning why they failed, what happened, and what can they do better. And that's the essence
Hmm.
of a lot of this, is that things are not going to go as planned most of the time. And so the question is, what are you going to do about it, and how are you going to manage? And if you happen to
Hmm.
fail, how do you really learn from what transpired?
Exactly, exactly. And that's very much proves the fact that, let's say, I heard about conflict and talk a lot about conflicts when we talk about communication, that we sometimes we don't, we assume we have no conflict. We think we have got an agreement, but it's a hidden conflict because we live based or we make judgments based on assumptions. And
Right.
this is where conflict appeared without any conflict, right? Because we met each other, we kind of agreed on something, but instead of getting results after the talk, we were silent, not getting to any conclusion. Would you call it a conflict as well? Call it based on,
Sure.
let's say, some kind of assumption-based discussion and a connection, and there is no result. So would you call it as a conflict as well in
Yeah,
terms of
I would.
communication process?
Conflict doesn't always have to be what we would say is overt, right? It doesn't have to always be out in the open. Somebody can be, if you and I have a difficult exchange, I may not realize it. I may not feel it. I might think Julia and I had a
Yeah,
productive conversation. You might feel like I was rude or a little bit
yeah.
too abrasive or whatever, right? And so it's very possible. And this is one of the
Mhm.
big problems when we talk about conflict is the psychological dimension, because much of conflict
Mm.
is happening in our minds as we process things. We are trying to understand what happened. And to your point about assumptions, we build a story about what happened. And we don't often share the assumptions we're making. And so the other
Right.
person doesn't realize what the problem is. I mean, this is one of the biggest challenges we face when we're dealing with conflict is that when you and I conflict, you often won't tell me exactly what the problem is. You'll
Yeah.
say, well, I'm upset or I'm frustrated or whatever it is. But I have to get down to what we would call, and you mentioned this before, your underlying interest, right? What's really motivating you in a conflict?
Motivating. Yeah. Yeah.
Um, if I don't understand that, it's very, very hard to solve a conflict. If I don't understand what's motivating you, why are you so upset? Why are you so frustrated? And this is where relationships become so important, right? If you and I have a relationship, you can say, well, Josh, you and I have worked together for a long time, and I have to tell you that, the way you handled this problem felt very inappropriate to me. Okay,
Yeah.
well, now I know that there's a problem here, and so I did something that was very inappropriate. And it gives me an opportunity to say, well,
Mm.
wow, okay, Julia, what happened? Like, what did I do
Yeah.
that I didn't know I did? Right. And
Yeah. Yeah.
so as I do more and more training and more advising and coaching with people, I'm focusing more on the internal realm, what's going on in your mind and how you're thinking about a situation. When people go into conflicts, most of them, a lot of times people will say to me, well, I don't want to confront them. And confront means often to push back hard and in a very adversarial kind of way. And I will usually say to people, look, I'm not asking you to confront them. I'm asking you to have a conversation with them. It's very different.
Mm.
And,
Exactly. And
you know,
approach. Yeah.
one,
Mhm.
when you talk about confrontation, that carries a thought that I have to push back hard and I have to do certain things that might damage the relationship. And that's not what you need. What you actually need is to figure out what's going on. It's a little bit, in some way, being an effective
Mhm.
negotiator or a conflict resolver is a little bit like being an investigative journalist. And,
Mhm.
usually when a story breaks, right, you get the headline, but then an investigative journalist looks into it more deeply and realizes that the story that came out isn't really what this is all about. And I think we can all think about conflicts where we thought it was about something, and then we learned from the other person something and realized, oh, this is actually, they've had this experience before, and now it's coming
Mm.
for them again in a really difficult kind of way. And that doesn't solve the problem, but it helps you to understand what's really happening. And that's one
Yeah.
of the keys is you have to be patient when you're dealing with conflict and negotiating. You have to ask a lot of questions because when
Mhm.
we're in these processes, we're always working with incomplete information. There's always things
Yeah.
that you, as Julia, know that I don't, and there are things that I know that you don't. And the question is, are we going to share that information, or not?
Yeah. Yeah. That's really true. And I would say, in my experience, discovering people needs, and also expectations and assumptions has been the key, let's say, talent that I developed in course of several years of working
Mhm.
across the world. In my case, it was very diverse approach, I would say, to discovery, because based on different cultures and markets, I've been uh, becoming even more and more empathical towards the needs of the clients and
Right.
my counterparts, stakeholders, partners, because I
Yep.
understood that without this open dialogue where I am listening, asking questions, and framing all the time, and reframing everything I hear, because like we often say, I want to get yes from you. But when I'm thinking about this concept, getting yes is so different from, let's say, getting yes from India, getting yes from France, it's different.
Sure.
From US, it's absolutely different yes, right? So, which
Right.
means that it should be very trustworthy environment, safe environment that we
Mhm.
build all together. Is it in at the negotiation table, or it can be even in verbal, non-verbal communication, or even in emails, right? We
Yeah.
can really create conflicts and misunderstandings without any reason. We
Yeah.
think we are doing everything right, but we might not get what we want, might not get support, understanding, trust, and no response. And
Right.
yes is not coming as yes, but they maybe or optional possibility for future, but not yes itself.
That's
That's where I would say I am learning every day, getting from different countries and partners across the world, how to
yeah.
translate and interpret yes
Right.
to
And I
my,
think
let's say, to my perception.
yeah, and I think you're in one sense you're lucky because you live in a part of the world where you're surrounded by people from very different cultures. Here in the United States, we live on a giant island, really,
Yeah,
surrounded by two huge oceans. And so a lot of people here, they're not as attuned to cultural dimensions of all of this. And it's a really important notion because culture is how we organize the world around us, right? It's how
absolutely.
we make
Yeah.
sense of what's going on. And for example,
Mm-hmm.
cultures that are very relational in nature, and this was a problem for a lot of American companies back in the 1980s and 90s who were traveling
Mm-hmm.
overseas to do business. They were very transactional in the way they approached things. And they realized as they went to places where relationships were critical, that they couldn't just jump into the transaction. They had to build relationships and get to know people. And, in general, anybody who does this work well knows the importance of relationships because relationships are sort of as one of my colleagues likes to say, it's sort of like a deposit in the bank, right? And when you need it, you can fall back on it. Um,
Exactly.
and people are going to be more willing to share when you have a good
Mm-hmm.
relationship with them. They're also going to be less willing to use, say, a power, if they have power over you, but you have a really good relationship, they're going to be less likely to use their power because they don't see a need to, right? So
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
there are a lot of these dynamics that are essential to negotiation and dealing with conflict. And in fact, it's the dynamics that often make all of this that much more challenging because, when we don't have power, we have to think, well, what do we do when that's the challenge, right? A lot of times people will just
Yeah.
sort of throw their hands up and say, I hope they give me something. And that's not
Yeah.
really a good strategy. There's ways as a
Mm-hmm.
weaker party to try to approach situations by, to your point, by framing, right? And reframing a situation or understanding your alternatives, your BATNA, your best alternative to a negotiated agreement,
Yeah.
things
Yeah.
like that. Um,
Exactly.
so this is why it's so important to know all of this, because when you know all of this, then you have,
Yeah.
if you imagine a shelf with a bunch of tools on it, right? You learn what tools you can take off the shelf and when to use those tools at different moments.
Absolutely. And tools, and as far as I know as well from my clients, they have to have in mind kind of awareness, even if they are not very well, let's say, trained, skilled, maybe not participating in amazing trainings like you are doing, but if they are at least aware of possible differences in terms of, let's say, culture, decision-making styles, communication styles,
Hmm.
and if you at least are aware of these possible, let's say, diverse approaches and where the conflicts or misunderstandings may happen,
Yeah.
this awareness makes them feel much more confident about going forward with, again, very open discussion and trustworthy relationships, because at least they might be not professionals and strategized, very well strategically equipped negotiators, but if they
Mhm.
are first of all able to listen, be ready, oriented not only on their own goals, but first of all on a client or their
Yeah.
values,
Right.
and be credible if they are credible with what they are saying and doing, and also being empathical about where counterpart is
Yeah.
currently, what kind of problems or situations facing, what are
Mhm.
the feelings they are currently experiencing,
Yeah.
and credibility and maybe reliability. So they really are doing what they're doing and saying what they are doing, and everything
Mhm.
goes in line.
Right.
So I think that negotiator can be born in certain way. Let's say if they have talents to be credible, reliable, and empathical personality, at the same time listen to their needs, they might find very good conclusion with client, or commitment, and also
Mhm.
trustworthy relationships. What would you say about that? Because I
Well,
can imagine you have seen so many negotiators all around the world.
yeah, I mean, first of all, like we're all born with certain strengths and weaknesses. That's just how it works. I mean, but I'm a very big believer that this is the kind of knowledge and skill that you learn.
Yeah.
Awareness comes from education, and education can happen in lots of ways. It can happen through experience, it can happen through reading a book, it can happen through, being in a program, right? And all of those are valuable and all of those are useful. And so the first step, as you say, is understanding the dynamics involved in all this through awareness. I think it's really important. You talked about empathy.
Mhm.
One of the things that people often fail to do is they fail to understand kind of the needs of the other and the interdependent relationship, meaning I'm not going to get
Yeah.
yes unless you have the ability to meet your interests as well, and for you to get to yes, right? There's an interdependence between us, and I think one of the classic mistakes is that when people prepare for a negotiation, they'll think about what they want, but they don't really think too
Mm.
much about what the other
But
side.
the other ones. Yeah,
And the reality
exactly.
is you're going to be trying to persuade them. So you ought to be thinking about what's important to them. Otherwise, they're not going to be persuaded, right? They don't care.
Yeah. Mm.
They care about what you need, but they also very much are interested in meeting their own goals and objectives. So you have to do both. And it's sort of, there are different tensions in negotiation, okay? And one of them is empathy and assertiveness. Okay. So much of the time people are good at one or the other, right? That if somebody
Yeah.
is very empathic and can empathize with somebody else and understand what they need, sometimes they have a hard time asking for what's important to them, right?
Mm.
The reality is you have to do both because you're not going to get what you need unless you ask for it, right? And sometimes people say, "Well, I'm worried I might offend the other person if I do that." And I would often say to folks, there's a difference between assertiveness and aggressiveness.
Hmm.
Assertiveness is as my colleague William Ury, who you know the name and perhaps you've met him or read his things, he likes to say assertiveness is standing on your own 2 feet. Aggressiveness is standing on someone else's toes. And I think that that's a really good way of thinking about it. So when you're assertive, you're clearly articulating and clearly saying, this is what I need in order to solve this conflict or in order to reach a deal in this negotiation. You're not
Hmm.
beating the other side up with your words and you're not trying to take advantage of them and things like that. That's where the line is where you become aggressive when you start humiliating the other or trying to find fault in them or trying to use tactics that might work in the short term but create an enemy in the long term. So I
Exactly.
think it's really important that people understand that you have to empathize, you have to understand where the other is coming from and what they need.
Mm.
And you also have to be able to clearly say, look, here's the thing that I have to have as part of this scenario. And I can't really, give up on that. I can be creative about how we get there. And this is, I think, a really important point for people listening, which is to me, all of these processes really are about creativity, much more so than compromise. Too often people rush to compromise and they say, well,
Mm.
what am I willing to give up in order to reach a deal? And you can always
Mm-hmm.
compromise. I don't, I try to help people to sort of hold off on that and wait. And that be the very last thing they think about. Better to try to understand what's really motivating people and to see if there's a creative solution that doesn't require you to give up something of great importance. It's actually,
Mm-hmm.
the reason why a lot of people don't like to negotiate is because they feel like the only way they can reach some agreement is because they have to
Yeah.
give up something really, really important. And who would want to do that? Who would go into a process and think that way, right? And so 4 years ago or 5 years ago now, I wrote a book called The Book of Real World Negotiations. And that was 25 cases of real negotiations where if you pick it up and read it, what you notice is there's very little compromise. There's much more of what we've been talking about of getting down to underlying interest and understanding what's really motivating people, what's driving them. And then when you do that, often you can see a solution that sort of emerges before your eyes because you now understand what was really important to the other side.
Yeah, yeah, true, true. And when we speak about relationships, I translate this into, let's say, different lenses. There are different lenses how we read relationships. Is it in if we call them or classify them by cultures, then there can be content related relationships or content oriented, like you really need to be reliable on what you provide.
Mhm.
And the other cultures, you will be more like relationships as a trust and personal, not that
Yeah,
much content, but more personal
yeah,
values are taken into account. So let's say we compare, I don't know, Swedish, which is very feminine culture, where relationships are built on this kind of feeling of balance, of and, protected and also respected environment around you. So that's why every single argument that you provide should be considered with very much of empathy about how does it reflect their, let's say, are they somehow affecting their security or insecurity. We need to be very, very careful about how and what we say and
hmm
how we get these relationships through in order to get to the next stage. And this probably will take some time because, in Sweden, in or these feminine cultures, it takes like circles, negotiation process is ongoing into group discussions, and they're finding consensus.
yeah,
And then compromise is possible only when you have gone all these stages. You have, first of all, built this safe environment about each other.
yeah,
And then, yes, we will find out the conclusion that will be less risky for each other, very trustworthy, and very long-term oriented. Let's say we see a lot of potential for the future.
right.
And then, let's say, a Swedish partner would in somehow try to invest his or her attention, time, and efforts in order to build these relationships.
Yeah.
And I can take, let's say, other masculine country or culture like Germany, for example, which can be
Mm.
somehow also very close to US style, American style, because they are more direct and more oriented on results and
Yeah,
value that you bring to each other immediately, right? Give me idea, I will buy it, and yes, prove it with some content. And I'm here to dive more into the, let's say, what is interest for me into this
yeah,
commitment and conclusion. So
yeah,
relationships are not the same everywhere. That I would say
right.
that
Yeah,
trust and relationships are absolutely different while you work on them, and how you reach this conclusion, commitment, and some kind of next step is like a huge journey.
mhm,
Like you mentioned somewhere also, it's not the destination, it's a journey.
yeah,
And it's so hard to sometimes gain this trust in some countries and
yeah,
cultures, and it's so simple to lose it just by again doing so much analysis and on your own needs rather than on the needs of the others. This is where
yeah,
everybody fails most of the cases. Yeah.
yeah. And I would say too, one of the mistakes I think a lot of people make is they don't when we talk about interests, I often put them into kind of two categories of tangible and intangible. So tangible
Mm-hmm.
is like anything you can touch, right? It's budgets, it's money, it's land, it's cell phones, who knows what, right?
Yeah.
But intangible are the things that make us human, right? And if
Mm-hmm.
those are all often not only a part of the process, but when we run into a problem, those are the things that are getting in the way. Somehow I embarrassed you, you were offended, you looked bad as a result of what we were doing. Who knows, right? And you don't negotiate or you don't deal with conflict with robots. You deal with them with people. I mean, maybe with AI, someday we will be dealing with robots, but and we are actually in many ways. But the reality is that when people get stuck in a negotiation or in a difficult conflict, more often than not, it goes back to the intangible realm. It goes back to something from a very personal point of view, whether they're embarrassed, they don't know how to do something, or they can't admit
Mm-hmm.
failure, they don't know how to, go share something with their boss. There's a whole list of things. But what I see is people will not want to focus on that area. They'll want to keep thinking about the tangible, like let's give them more money. And I'm like, this isn't about money.
Mm-hmm.
It's about them feeling disrespected or their identity somehow being challenged by what's going on. And
Yeah.
I think
Yeah.
one of the really important parts to this whole conversation is the preparation and the analysis. People often will just dive into a negotiation or into a conflict without really understanding what's going on. And it's really important to take time to analyze and to say, well, how do I know this is what's really at the heart of this problem? And does the other person see it the same way? Because it's not uncommon for you and I to be in a conflict and for us to see things differently and for you to see the source of
Mm-hmm.
conflict differently than me. Um, so it's really important that people slow the process down. I notice when people are talking about dealing with conflict and negotiating, they want to rush through it as fast as they can. And I try to slow people down because I think when you slow people down, you're more thoughtful and you
Mm-hmm.
also catch potential problems and mistakes and things along those lines. Um, if you're paying attention to that and not just trying to rush for some kind of a solution.
Absolutely, yeah. And what is the secret of great preparation? Because in my situation, I sometimes coming to such great negotiations by the end without long preparation. It's kind of, I had amazing intuition, like probably that's a talent, I don't know. But when I meet person, I kind of start to dive into their situation and empathy is part of me, my personality. That's why it comes so natural. And
Yeah,
sometimes when I do overcomplicate things, I lose this feeling, I lose the real sense of the moment, because probably I was thinking too much, preparing too much, and I became less human when I spoke to my client
yeah,
or counter. And of course, there should be a good balance. I would say that's my formula of success that I also see from my
yeah,
clients. That one thing I leave for real preparation, where you use a lot of market analysis, you get numbers in your head, you get some really strong facts in your mind that to kind of
yeah.
equip you strongly. But then I leave some space for naturality, like natural feelings, how you feel, what is something that would raise
Yeah,
their interest more? What is something that would make them feel more comfortable with you
right.
going forward? So, yeah,
Yeah.
how do you feel about it?
Yeah, I
Mhm.
think that's the right way to do it. I mean, the way that I try to help people to think this through, first of all, is that you don't want to go into a negotiation or a conflict with a really specific plan because
Mm-hmm.
there's too much information you don't have as
Yeah.
part, when you go into a situation like that. So it's important to go through, do your market analysis, gather your data, et cetera, but it's also important to do it in what I would call what's called a contingency planning way. So,
Mm-hmm.
contingency planning for those people who don't really know, you still have your same goals, right? But instead of having one way of getting there, you might have three or four different ways of trying to achieve the same end, right? So that if I
Mm-hmm.
start to negotiate and things aren't going well and my approach is not working, I can shift to a different way of doing things. I think where people get into trouble is they don't plan that way. They plan
Yeah.
very sort of, I'm going to do A, then I'm going to do B, then I'm going to do C, and I'm going to get to D. And negotiation
Yeah.
and conflict simply don't work that way. So you have to, combine contingency planning basically with sort of flexibility and adaptability. It's one of the
Mm.
core skills of being a great negotiator and handling conflict well is embracing flexibility and being adaptable and not holding so
Yeah.
tightly to one way of doing things. When you have a flexible mindset, you can sort of adjust and shift and say, okay, that didn't work.
Mhm.
I still need to get here. What else can I try to do? Right. And I think
Exactly.
that's,
Mhm.
people are, I think when you plan like that, it's easier to be in problem solving mode and to sort of find a way forward if you stay at the table and give it the kind of time and effort that it requires.
Mhm.
I think
Mhm.
that's the, so if I see a mistake, it's that people are trying to plan too carefully for a
Predict.
negotiation and it doesn't work. You
Yeah.
definitely
No.
want to go through, Dwight Eisenhower, the former US president, and he was a general, said plans are useless, but planning is everything. And I
Yeah.
think
Exactly.
that's what we're aiming for when we negotiate and when we deal with conflict is let me, go through the planning process. Let me have a way of approaching things. But let me
Mm.
be flexible and adaptable. It's, the way that I like to try to, put it in simple terms for people is it's a little bit like playing chess, right?
Yeah.
I have a
Yeah.
strategy and an approach, but my approach isn't solely dependent on me. It's also dependent on what the other side says and does. And so I have to
Mm.
adapt to what is coming back at me, what kind of information or what kind of feedback I'm getting, or, if somebody does something or raises an issue that I didn't realize was part of a conflict, I have to adapt to that. And I have to think about how do I
Yeah.
take that in and still
Mm-hmm.
figure out where I'm going, right? And I think that's something that people need to learn. There are a lot of my students and others that I train say, I'm not good at being flexible and adaptable. Like I need to have a plan. And they say,
Mm.
what can I do? And I say, well, you can learn to be adaptable. There's no
Practice.
real,
Practice.
yeah. And
Mm-hmm.
one thing that we do, um, on that front is that we um, use the skills of improv. So improv is like improvisational comedy. So if you've ever seen two people on a stage where somebody starts a conversation and then the next person picks up on that conversation and they sort of go back and forth in a comedy routine, that's improv, right? And what it does is
Mm.
it trains your mind. And so in the book you mentioned that I published back in February called Getting Back to the Table, I share a handful of exercises at the back of the book on how to learn to be adaptable and flexible and how
Adaptable.
you think on your feet kind of thing.
Mhm.
And I was
But in
fortunate
order,
to get to
yeah.
to get to know some people who do this professionally and
Mm.
weave it into the work that I do because when people feel very constrained and they don't feel like they can adapt, they're going to struggle when it comes to negotiation and dealing
Yeah.
with conflict. So we have to learn how to help people to do that effectively.
For sure. And it's a journey of, as far as I realized, and I also started to write that in my book, that I also realized that to get this adaptability and flexibility, first of all, it's not like something that you can learn from book. You can collect it from everything, from your experience, from different cases where you really feel the trigger. You are triggered in certain way. That's why you have to train your emotional intelligence, be ready for all these circumstances that you probably are challenging yourself more and more every time. The more you challenge yourself, you get ready for
Right.
new learning and new step, and you overcome something internally, and you kind of become mindful of your triggers, of your reactions.
Yeah.
And this is how you become also more equipped and skilled and
Right.
stable to be adaptable, right?
Yeah.
That's one thing. Emotional intelligence, I would put it like one component. The second component for the person who wants to grow and reach certain level of growth is growth mindset. Is exactly what you mean. It's not something where saying that you have learned something, it will stay with you forever. No, it's always will be different, and every single step, is it successful or unsuccessful, will bring you a lot of new learnings. And this growth mindset really, really is important nowadays, because I feel that some people really rely on some fixed data or
Mm.
skill or
Yeah.
tool, and they think it's enough. I got like my diploma that's saying everything, or
Yeah. Right. Right.
the AI tool that I'm using is also the best thing to use, because I know it's proven, I know it's clear, it's trusted. But same for communication and building relationships across the world. You need to
Right.
be very careful and adaptable and growth mindset oriented. So you see that it's how different people are with their values and needs, and
Right.
be ready for any type of diversity, right, in terms of communication.
Yeah.
And the third thing I would add
Yeah.
is, of course, intercultural understanding. So if you are like putting all these three things together, you are global growth mindset oriented. You are strong. You
Mm.
are equipped for dealing with any type of uncertainties. And uncertainties are the best triggers for us for learning
They,
adaptability, I would say.
absolutely. And I think what our conversation highlights, I think hopefully for your listeners is that this is all very difficult stuff. I mean, we've talked about a lot of different components that you need to be good at in order to do this effectively. And so the one thing I would say to people, if they're listening and they want to sort of be, educate themselves and work on this aspect of their career, which will greatly benefit them. I can't emphasize that enough, that if you invest time and energy into this realm, it will make you better at what you do. You
Yeah.
know, in essence, it's going to help you to deal with people, which is the hardest part of most people's jobs, right? But it's difficult. And so you have to be sort of kind with yourself and give yourself a break and not expect too
Mhm.
much. And that when you don't succeed, that you don't say, I don't ever want to do that again. You say, okay, that didn't work. That's not what I was hoping. Let me try to figure out what happened here and make sure I don't do that again. Right. And grow from that experience. And to your point,
Mhm.
the idea of a growth versus a fixed mindset was developed by this woman, Carol Dweck. And,
Carol.
a fixed mindset is somebody who looks at something and says, I'm not good at that. I can't do that. I'll never be good at math, was one of the things my kids would say when I was a kid, when they were younger. And I would try to say, you can be good at anything if you work hard enough at it, and that you have what Dweck calls this growth mindset, where you look at a situation and you say, I may not be a genius in this realm, but I know I can get better if I put the time and effort into this, whatever it is that I'm doing, right? And I
Mm-hmm.
think that's really, really important, because everything, in order to be an effective negotiator or conflict resolver, you have to have persistence and resilience. And
Yeah.
you become persistent and resilient if you have a growth mindset. You don't if you have a fixed mindset and say, well, I'm not good at that, so why bother putting time and effort into it? Well, you never will
Mm-hmm.
know how good you can be if you simply have that attitude. So adopting the notion that I can be better at anything, I may not be the greatest,
Yeah.
world at this, but I can definitely be better. And listen, when I teach people, everyone has their own ceiling, as I like to put it, right? The place that they can get to. And so you should
Mm-hmm.
compare yourself to others. You can only compare yourself to you. And you can say, these are the things that I do really well, and I'm going to build on those things. And
Mm-hmm.
these are the places where I struggle, and I'm going to keep working at those. And I will get better. I will see, um, improvement in the master's program that I run. It used to be a women's university. It's now for everyone, but I still, I would say that about 80% of the students that I get are women, and their biggest challenge is assertiveness. And when they come in the
Mm.
program, they say, I'm never going to be good at being assertive. There's too many cultural constraints in the United States or whatever, that women aren't supposed to ask, and women aren't supposed to do this or that or that. And by the time they leave the program, they all of them say to me, I will never not ask again. I will always assert for myself because I know no one's going to do it for me. And that's
Oh,
like tremendous growth and learning and saying, I'm not going to
yeah.
accept certain norms, right? Certain things that are unfair towards certain groups of people. I'm going to push through that and say,
Mhm.
I'm going to ask for this. If you don't like it, that's okay, because your
Yeah.
reaction is not my challenge, right? For me as a negotiator, you have to be very clear what your objectives are, why you want those things, and you have to ask. And if you do,
Yeah.
you will find that it's not so bad. It's interesting when people for the first time ask and they get something in a negotiation, they will often say to me, that wasn't so bad. I just had to get over the hurdle of actually saying, this is what I need. And once
Hmm.
you've done it once, then you say, okay, I think I understand this. I think I get this. And so we're back to the psychological realm, right? We're
Yeah,
negotiating.
exactly.
A lot of people negotiate against themselves. And that's a place where we have to say, hang on,
Sure.
you're making assumptions. You're already deciding what the outcome is without ever having a conversation. And so you're limiting yourself in a way that's not helpful and not productive.
Absolutely. But there are so many countries or cultures where people are not direct in what they really want and
Right.
need.
Yep.
And you just have a silent face in front of you with no emotions,
Yep.
and you don't even guess what the person really feels. And you're kind of behaving as usual. You're asking right questions, but there is no reaction. So what would you do? Like, yeah, you can go to Denmark, for example, for such
Yeah.
experience,
Right.
and you
Well,
don't see the movement.
yeah. And I think that's where, so, everybody has these underlying interests that we're talking about. There was a guy named
Mhm.
Geert Hofstede who was a kind of peace psychologist many years ago, and he did a study and he essentially looked at the values of different cultures and different
Yeah,
societies and things like
I
that.
get it.
And one of
Yeah.
the things that he said was everybody has these underlying interests. The question is, when you're working in different cultures, how do you best go about trying to meet those interests, right? In some places, like you said, in the United States or in Russia or in Israel or in France, where you have very direct cultures, you ask directly, right? But in other places like in Korea, Japan, wherever, right? Many where face saving and face giving is a core component. You have to think very
Exactly.
creatively about how you still ask for your interest without doing it directly. And I think there are a
Yeah.
lot of examples of that. And this is where it's important to know that from a cultural point of view, here's what I can do and here's what I can't, right? It doesn't mean that I don't
Hmm.
ask. I think this is the important thing for your listeners. You still have to figure out a way to ask for these things. The question is, how do you do it in a culturally appropriate manner, right? And there are ways, even in places, there's an example that I share in one of my classes about a German guy who was working with the Chinese, and they were
Hmm.
the German guy represented a bicycle company, and they were buying 1,000 bicycles from this company in China. And when he went to see the bikes before they were shipped, they were squeaking and not working very well. And he didn't say anything directly to his Chinese counterpart. Um, and he didn't have to. They went out for a bike ride together, and the Chinese counterpart could
Hmm.
hear the problem. Now, an American, perhaps, for example, who didn't have the knowledge about Chinese culture would say, you're going to have to fix these things, right? Before we accept the bikes. Well, by saying that directly to them, you cause a loss of face. So he didn't have to say anything. He got off the bike. The German guy got off the bike. He said, "Okay, thank you very much." And the Chinese guy said, "We'll make these corrections and send them to you." Right? He knew enough to help that guy save face by not directly saying there's a problem with these bikes. The Chinese company understood that and knew it, right? And so that's an example of, still being able to figure out and highlight a problem without causing somebody to be embarrassed, by a
Yeah.
situation. So there's ways of managing it, but this is the complexity of the world that we deal with. And it is difficult, and I think that's something I want your listeners to understand is
Yeah,
it can be done and you can be really good at this. It just takes time and you have to be patient and you have to go and stay on that journey.
absolutely. So if we conclude then, global business leader, is it sales manager, director, CEO? What are these
Everybody.
three things? Yes, they need to consider in order to grow, not to be, but to grow as negotiator, because it's never ending process.
Right.
I've been
Yeah.
in millions of negotiations, but I still learn every day. So what do you
Yeah.
think is something that they need to have in their mindset, in their portfolio, and what
Yeah.
to aim for?
I mean, first of all, I think we've talked a lot about a lot of them, but I think the first one is to know what they don't know. That,
Mhm.
you know, yeah, you might have been working in the business world for 20 years, but if you have not invested the time and energy to really learn about negotiation so that you're being very strategic about everything, you're not going to be, as good at this as you can be. So I think the first thing is know what you don't know and invest time and energy in becoming and learning about the dynamics and the nuances and
Mhm.
what makes somebody really good at this. That's the first thing. The second thing is your mindset. I think it's really important to
Mhm.
go into these things. Again, if we go back to the idea that 80 to 90% of our negotiations are with the same people or companies over and over again, then we have to view them as a partner, not a best friend, not an enemy, but somebody we want to work with and we need to work with over time. And the goal of every negotiation should be to meet your short-term interest, right, whatever those
Mhm.
needs are, and to build the long-term relationship. If you have to
Yeah,
sacrifice the long-term relationship for the sake of a short-term deal, don't do it. And then I
yeah.
think the third thing is really, this notion of adaptability and flexibility. And also, for CEOs and people like that, people have often asked me regarding my book about setbacks and failures, what can a company do to help their employees to embrace this notion, right? We don't set out to fail, but we do fail. And so what do we do? And what a CEO can do, or a COO or a CFO or whatever, is they can create psychological safety. And they can say,
Mhm.
when this happens, it's obviously not what we wanted, but let's talk about it. Let's do a debrief and understand
Yeah.
what happened. Like create a sense in your organization, create a culture in your organization that says, hey, let's celebrate the successes and let's deal with the cold, hard facts of the failures so that we as an organization grow and we don't hide our failures. We don't run away from them. We embrace them and we say, okay, this is not what we hoped for. What do we do differently and better next time? I think those three
Yeah.
things are going to go a long way to helping anybody. And by the way, to me, we're all negotiators. We all negotiate every day, all day. So it's not just for
Mm.
COOs and CEOs and salespeople or procurement. It's everybody, whether you
Yeah.
negotiate internally or externally or whatever it might be. And just remember, again, conflicts are going to happen. And if you see them as part of the decision-making process, you don't have to run from them. You will be able to handle them if you learn how to do that and you learn the knowledge and skills and the kinds of things that we've been talking about for the last hour related to all of this. So that would be my advice, and to kind of lean into it. There's a lot of people who avoid conflict, but I think when you lean into it, you realize it's not nearly as bad as you think it might be. That the psychological
Mm.
dimensions of this really get in our way, and we have to push back against that.
Absolutely. And just don't forget that we are learning every day, and successful and unsuccessful negotiations is also a great step towards your next very successful result. So it's just a process of learning every day, and be and celebrate. Also, conflicts should be celebrated, like you said, yeah, because like in family life, if we have conflicts, means that we care about each other.
That's
It's
it.
a really bad sign if we don't have any conflicts, right?
Right.
Disagreements in the family. It means that we don't care about each other at all.
Right.
So,
Yeah. Yeah, exactly.
unless we try to help each other and try to solve something and improve, because every conflict will bring you to the next level. We will kind of find new way how to help each other better, how to care about each other better. Is it at work or family or in
Right.
your relationships with your partners?
Right.
So let's
Great.
continue caring about each other and the world, business world, and super glad that we had this discussion with you, Joshua. Thank you so much. I really look forward to see you again in Riga, Vilnius, or Tallinn anytime. You are always, always welcome.
Right.
I
Thank you.
really hope that our audience in Baltics, Nordic countries will have a pleasure to see you on the stage. And we'll think
Right.
about some future events that will inspire our business world for even more effective negotiations.
That would be great. I would love that.
Yeah,
Thank
with pleasure.
All right.
And
Take care.
wish you amazing summer holidays as well. Have a
Thank
good rest.
you too. All right. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thanks.